I am pleased beyond words to visit with so many Central Kentucky's job creators here this afternoon. And I want to thank Bob Quick and Katie Hardwick and all the hardworking people at Commerce Lexington that I've gotten to know over the past number of years, and for all of your excellent work for the people and the citizens of this area. I want to thank Kentucky American Water and Cheryl. And Cheryl, when you said that you thought maybe there was more than one of me, for those of you who met my younger brother Peter, who works for Haymaker Beam, some people really do think that there are more than one of us. But he's actually 7 years younger than me, so. But I want to thank all the other dignitaries and members of the community, both business leaders and also folks who serve our communities as mayors and members of the council and state representatives. Ryan Quarles, my friend. Thank you all for what you do. Now more than ever, our nation needs your energy, your creativity, and your ideas. And moreover, as I assume the solemn responsibility of representing the 6th Congressional District in the United States Congress, I need your wisdom and your experience. When we had the privilege of going up for orientation a few weeks ago to Washington, my wife Carol and I were invited to a dinner that was put on by Majority Leader Eric Cantor in the Library of Congress. There was a beautiful room, I don't even know what it's called, but beautiful room in there, and Arthur Brooks, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, gave an address to the incoming new freshman members of Congress. And he dispensed a whole lot of good advice. And one of his first pieces of advice was, the first thing you need to do when you get to Washington is that you need to find out who your friends really are. He said, I'll give you some advice about that. Your friends are the folks who stab you in the chest instead of the back. All of our eyes were very bright, and but that was kind of my rude introduction to Washington. We know that there's going to be some challenges, of course, and he was partly joking, but we also recognize that it will be some challenging times ahead. America has reached one of the most serious turning points in our history, in my judgment. Our quality of life and our character as a nation may well hang in the balance. And last November, American voters once again defied conventional wisdom. In an election that offered an opportunity to break the gridlock in Washington, they returned the same divided government. And my election was a recognition of that, I think. A re-election of the president and an election here in Kentucky of a conservative Republican to the U.S. House. In some ways, the electorate made bipartisanship even more challenging than it was before. The last Congress, which was renowned for polarization, had 42 crossover districts. Crossover districts are where voters had chosen a member of the House from one party and a presidential candidate from the other. In the coming Congress, in the 113th Congress, the new number of crossover districts will only be 24. That's 24 out of 435 members of Congress. But in doing so, even though the American people restored and perhaps accentuated divided government, I do not believe they chose the status quo. I do not believe they chose the status quo at all. Instead, I believe they sent both parties back to Washington with an unmistakably clear message. Resolve our current crises, and that will require participation from everyone. Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, moderates, people from all backgrounds and all walks of life. And in my brief experience in Washington as a member-elect of the House of Representatives, and in meeting some of my new colleagues from around the country, many Democrats that I have quickly become acquainted with and forging new relationships with, I can tell you there is dramatic diversity that reflects the diversity of the American people, and that's a strength, not a weakness. In many respects, this is the way the founders of our country wanted it. It is by constitutional design. The founders of our country, in their genius, deliberately made government inefficient. And they did so through checks and balances and separation of powers. But to get bills passed, to get initiatives achieved, to get things done, It requires negotiation and compromise, and it is going to require negotiation and compromise in the coming days to avert the fiscal cliff, and in coming years to deal with our debt crisis and to get the American people back to work. You know, when I was elected, the night of the election, it was such a blur. There was a lot of things that I don't even remember, but one moment really struck out at me, and it was being reminded by a former congressman who represented this congressional district that this is the seat of Henry Clay. This is the Ashland district, and what a tremendous source of pride that is to represent the same congressional district that Henry Clay, the namesake for my high school. And I grew up not too far from Ashland. It is going to require compromise, and the great compromiser, of course, is a model for that. But everybody knows that I come to this office based on a specific set of principles and beliefs. And I ran for Congress for a reason. That was to make a difference, because I truly believe that the philosophy that I hold will help more people. And while I based my campaign on Congress on a number of specific proposals, the core of my candidacy was a promise of accessibility. And I don't care how you voted or whether you support any of my strongly held positions, but if you live in Kentucky's 6th Congressional District, I want to speak with you. I want to understand the challenges you face in your life. I want to know what you believe and how you think I can help you. I strongly believe that this kind of dialogue re-energizes a sense of shared purpose. More often than not, it can help us rediscover our shared values. Time and again during our campaign for Congress, I witnessed this miracle of America, and as Warren indicated, in traveling especially to these new counties, dominated frankly by members of the other party, I visited these heavily Democratic communities. And when we talked to the people of these communities, and more importantly, when I listened to the people of these communities, I found ways to move forward together. The problem today is that politicians spend too much time repeating each other's talking points while failing to express the principles behind their positions. So strip away the party labels and even ideological labels, and rather than focusing on specific policy positions, I want to use our time together today to discuss principles that will guide my decisions as your representative in Congress. First, fighting for Kentucky's signature industries will always be my highest priority. Obviously, everybody remembers from the campaign, we focused a lot of time and attention on the war on coal as the most salient expression of this broader principle. I simply believe that you cannot represent the people of this district without working to ensure the continued health and viability of the businesses that provide jobs and prosperity. And the coal industry is one of those here in Kentucky. But whether you work in the beef cattle industry or the tobacco industry, whether you're in the thoroughbred horse industry or the bourbon industry, whether you're at Toyota Chem and the auto manufacturing industry, you can count on the same vigorous defense and diligent attention that I gave to coal during the campaign, and I will devote that time and attention to those key critical industries as well. Likewise, I will be a zealous advocate for our institutions of higher learning right here in central and eastern Kentucky. We are blessed with an incredible number of dedicated teaching and research professionals at places like the University of Kentucky. Steve, we were talking earlier today, and Tom, we were talking about how excited I am to get a chance to spend more time with Dr. Capilouto and learn about the initiatives and priorities of my alma mater, the College of Law, Dean Brennan, the College of Law, and also the broader university community, what the priorities are at the University of Kentucky. I applaud Dr. Todd's vision for making the University of Kentucky a top 20 research institution. We need to advance that, and we need to help collaborate with Dr. Capilouto in implementing his initiatives. Obviously, Eastern Kentucky University. I spent a lot of time in Madison County, and the people of Madison County really expressed their support for our vision with the vote down in Madison County. And Eastern Kentucky University is so critical to that part of the congressional district. Kentucky State University in Frankfort. I look forward to meeting with Dr. Williams next week, Transylvania. such a critical liberal arts institution here in Lexington, Berea College in southern Madison County, Georgetown College, and the Bluegrass Community and Technical College, so critical to providing that pathway to work for so many people at this time where we really need to provide jobs and opportunities for our people. So even at this time of fiscal crisis, I know we can find a way to provide these educational assets with the resources they so desperately need. Healthcare is a huge issue and industry in this part of the state with the University of Kentucky, with Baptist, and with Kentucky One Health. I will continue to be an advocate for healthcare in this area, which is a huge employer, an important part of our important source of jobs and the vitality of this community. I will also continue to reach out to every local leader, regardless of party. Recently, I had an extremely productive meeting with Mayor Gray, and I'm excited about working with him on a number of projects. Of course, Commerce Lexington has led the way for many years, showing us all how we can engage in different communities and economic sectors in a common cause. As a graduate of Leadership Lexington, I can attest firsthand to this sustained excellence of your initiatives, and had an opportunity to attend and visit with many of you on many of the leadership visits to Oklahoma City and Austin and Greenville, South Carolina, and really applaud you for those initiatives. I got a chance to talk briefly outside of the Cannon office building with Congressman Yarmouth in Louisville, and I'm excited about working with him in any ways that we can to support the BEAM initiative. I talked to Mayor Gray about this, look forward to meeting with Mayor Fisher. Of course, the Bluegrass Economic Advancement Movement, a way to promote economic development in a bipartisan way through the two kind of flagship cities and the corridor that connects those two cities. That has got to be our focus to get the people of this state back to work and to advance our positioning as a economic engine in this state. So that's the first principle, is being accessible to you and to working with this community to promote and be accessible and hear your ideas. A second and related principle that will guide me as a member of Congress, and I talked about this a lot in the campaign, is that a government of the people and for the people must trust the people. This fundamental value underlies much of today's discussion regarding how to avert the so-called fiscal cliff, a debate which is really about the role of government in our lives and our economy. Regrettably, the argument has become entirely focused on raising taxes or cutting spending, when history really shows that economic growth and common sense spending restraint provides the solution. Unleashing the American people, trusting the American people to lead the way. This, I think, is the solution to both our debt crisis that we face, this $16.3 trillion national debt that we face as a country, that is literally threatening to bankrupt our country, and the jobs crisis, this persistent high unemployment that is preventing the people of this country from realizing their potential. So whatever your ideology is, whoever you voted for, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, we should all be able in this room and in the Congress of the United States and across this country, we should all be able to agree that we cannot achieve our objectives as a country without economic prosperity. Whether you want to invest in public education and a robust social safety net, or if you want to promote free market capitalism and the profit motive, we have to have economic growth. We have to have economic growth so that we have the tax revenue and the revenue base to support those public initiatives like education, like taking care of those who cannot take care of themselves. And so growth and the lack of growth really is at the core of our problem as a country right now. Economic growth for the first 9 months of 2012 was 1.7%. That is slower than growth last year, 1.8%, which is in turn slower than the year before, which was 2.4%. And it's certainly much lower, all of those growth rates are much lower than the long-term average of 3.3%. And so let's come together as a country and as a Congress and do everything we can to promote growth and stop everything that impairs growth. If Congress fails to act in the next few weeks, average households in this country will see a tax increase of around $4,100. Now, in my judgment, this is not a recipe for economic recovery. This is not a recipe for economic growth. Now, we do need to deal with our debt crisis. We need to find ways to match revenues with our spending. The president, of course, has signaled his desire for large tax increases. In the recent negotiations last week, the number that he and Secretary Geithner proposed was $1.6 trillion in new taxes. Now, that's on top of the new health care laws, 21 new taxes that would cost the American taxpayers $1 trillion over the next decade. But my question to you all, and my question to my colleagues in the House of Representatives in a few weeks will be this. Does anyone truly believe that the problem is that the American people do not pay enough in federal taxes? Now, I strongly disagree with the idea that we need to impose more tax burdens on the American people, and I oppose that for three reasons. Number one, the taxpayers are not to blame for our current debt crisis. Number two, the cause is spending. The cause of our debt crisis is really spending and not too little in taxes. And third, I just think raising taxes is a lousy deficit reduction strategy. Now let's unpack each of those and talk about each. First of all, I don't think the taxpayers are to blame for this. You know, for years and years and years, the American taxpayers have sent their taxes to Washington. And politicians, for years and years and years, have spent more than the American taxpayers have given them. It makes no sense to me for politicians now to come to the American people and say that it's your fault, that you're not paying your fair share. It's really not their fault. It's the politicians who have been in Washington who have spent more than the American taxpayers have provided them over the years. The second point that I was making is that really, if you think about it, the cause of our deficits and our debt crisis is a spending problem. It's not too little in taxes. And let me give you a few thoughts to support that proposition. In fiscal year 2012, the federal government collected $2.4 trillion in taxes. Now that's an increase despite the lagging economy. That's an increase of 6.4% compared to last year. And it's close to the historic high of revenue collected in 2007 before the financial crisis. But federal spending in fiscal year 2012 was over $3.5 trillion, which is the fourth year in a row that spending has been above $3 trillion. So the main driver of our long-term deficits is government spending, not a lack of revenue. Revenue, in fact, will surpass its historic average of 18.1% of gross domestic product by 2018. But spending remains well above its historic average of 20.2%. It is 23.3% of GDP today, and it's projected to be 22.1% of GDP by 2022, even after $2.1 trillion in spending cuts in the Budget Control Act. And many people don't expect Congress to allow those spending cuts to go into effect in the course of these fiscal cliff negotiations. Furthermore, without major reform, entitlement spending, mandatory spending, autopilot spending, and interest on the debt alone is projected to consume 100% of all tax revenue to the federal government by 2025. Now, this is an important point. If you don't think that spending is a problem, just consider this basic fact. By 2025, 100% of every dollar that the American taxpayers send to Washington will be spent on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and interest on the national debt. That leaves absolutely no room for transportation and infrastructure, national institutes of health, all of our higher education institutions, the Department of Education, any kind of initiative that your community or nonprofit organizations depend on. None of it is covered unless we reform our autopilot mandatory spending programs. So, that point, I think, is fairly well made, and that is that we have got to deal with the true cause of our deficits, and that is our mandatory autopilot spending. And the third point I was making is that I think that raising taxes is simply a lousy deficit reduction strategy. The Joint Tax Committee estimates that the president's plan to raise taxes on capital gains, dividends, and incomes above $200,000 while reinstating deduction phase-outs would yield about $823 billion over 10 years. That's barely more than the $749 billion that we would generate by simply capping deductions at $50,000 a year. At an annual average of $82 billion a year in revenue, it's merely 7.5% of last year's $1.1 trillion federal budget deficit. So, the president's tax increases would literally deal with only 7.5% of our $1.1 trillion annual deficit. It's just not a serious proposal. Even if government confiscated 100% of the income of all millionaires and billionaires that Mr. Obama likes to single out, that would yield only $938 billion, less than 1 year's budget deficit. It also fails to take into account the dynamic effect of higher taxes on job producers, job creators, small businesses. Remember, most small businesses in this country, most of you who are small business owners and entrepreneurs, you are the job creators in this country. You are the people who take a risk, take out a loan, hire more people, and grow your businesses that way. Most of you are organized as limited liability entities or S corporations. You pay taxes on an individual level, as under individual tax rates. So, Ernst & Young has done a study about this. What if we raise taxes on the top two brackets, the marginal income tax rates for the top two brackets? Ernst & Young says that we would lose 710,000 jobs. Nearly 1 million small businesses in this country would be impacted by increasing rates, marginal income tax rates, on the top two rates. So, when will we stop thinking about tax increases now and the promise of discretionary spending cuts later? We cannot believe that that will ever lead to real deficit reduction, real resolution of our debt crisis. It won't. That strategy has never worked, and it never will, because politicians simply cannot be trusted to actually save and not spend the revenues raised by these tax increases. In my judgment, fiscal responsibility means real spending cuts now, and revenues through economic growth, not higher taxes. We need only look back as far as the 1990s for an example when a Republican Congress and a Democratic president worked together to achieve these goals. In 1995, despite two major tax increases in 1990 and 1993, the experts were still projecting deficits of $200 billion or more as far as the eye can see in 1995. Gridlock was a popular term then as well. But in 1997, when I was actually serving as a staffer in the Congress for Jim Talent, the Republican Congress and President Clinton acted in a bipartisan way to cut the capital gains rate by almost 1/3. And as a result, the American economy produced 11.5 million new jobs. Wages grew almost 10 times faster, and we reached a surplus for the first time in years in 1998. Now, how did a tax cut produce and lead to a surplus? Through economic growth. In fact, increased federal revenue has repeatedly been the results of tax cuts. Federal revenue doubled during the 10 years that followed the across-the-board tax cuts that President Kennedy and President Reagan proposed, yet federal spending also doubled, and that's what produced our deficits. And the federal government experienced record revenues again in 2007 following the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts. Once again, however, we failed to control spending, and our deficit situation spiraled out of control. The federal government experienced surpluses in the late 1990s because the economy grew and spending didn't, at least not as fast. In fact, during President Clinton's 8 years in office, federal revenue increased 86%. Federal spending only grew 29%. And I hasten to add that 60% of the revenue growth under President Clinton's administration occurred after the 1997 capital gains tax cuts. Yet some politicians act as if asking the wealthy to pay a little bit more will magically solve our debt crisis, even though studies have shown that the federal government, as I said before, could confiscate 100% of all of the income of all millionaires and billionaires and still not come up with enough revenue to cover the deficit. my friends, we simply cannot tax our way out of this mess. We also can't just cut our way out of this mess. We have to grow. And so everything we do should be focused on economic growth. Now let me just kind of conclude my remarks by saying this. What will produce growth? What will help the people of central and eastern Kentucky? What will help the people of this country achieve economic growth and increase those revenues and control spending so that we can achieve a balanced budget? I've just got a few ideas, and I welcome yours in the days and the months ahead. I need your help. I want your ideas. How can we get the American people back to work? I think we can get to normal levels of revenue again if we get the American people back to work. If more people are working and participating in the economy, paying taxes, we are going to be able to achieve deficit reduction and, more importantly, prosperity for the American people. I think we've got to hold the line on these tax rates. I think the truth of the matter is, in the spirit of Henry Clay, we're going to have to compromise. We don't have a choice. We have divided government. We're going to have to deal with this. The president wants higher taxes. Republicans in Congress do not. But we're going to have to come together. I want to do so in a way that doesn't impair growth. Maybe we can broaden the base and lower the rates, or at least preserve the rates where they are, or simplify the tax code, make it more efficient. Maybe we can generate some more revenue that way, not through confiscating more income from entrepreneurs and small businesses, but by promoting economic recovery. I think we also need to deal with the regulatory environment in this country. I was glad to see that Commerce Lexington, on their public policy initiatives, embraced retiring Congressman Jeff Davis's proposal for the REINS Act. It's a great idea that would require all major new regulations to be approved by the Congress before they go into effect. Yes, we need to promote the coal industry and the energy sector. The REINS Act is one way we can do that. The financial services industry is under assault. One of the reasons why we're not recovering as a country in our economy is because our community banks are being blamed for the financial crisis. The community banks and the regional banks that serve the people of central and eastern Kentucky did not cause the financial crisis. So we've got to retool Dodd-Frank to provide an exemption for small community banks so that they don't have to deal with unreasonable examinations. We need to make sure that small businesses and farmers and manufacturing companies and entrepreneurs have access to the capital that they need to hire and expand and create new jobs. So we need to revisit financial reform for sure. I think clearly we've got to deal with health care reform. The re-election of the president makes repeal of the Affordable Care Act unlikely, but the employer mandate is preventing economic recovery. And so I want to work with you and small businesses and with my colleagues in the House to deal with the problems associated with these new tax increases and with the employer mandate, which is actually a deterrent from hiring in the new Affordable Care Act. Obviously, deficit reduction is important to create certainty for our long-term fiscal situation. And we need to promote more domestic energy production in this country, not just coal, but also oil and natural gas. We need to achieve energy independence. This can create jobs for the American people. It can help us achieve energy independence for our national security, our economic security, and it can certainly lower fuel prices and electricity costs for the American people. So these are some of the ideas that I have. I welcome yours. But let's just recognize this basic fact of history. Regardless of ideology, we need to agree at the very least that prosperity must be our fundamental goal. And it isn't required that we be partisan or that we necessarily fall back into our ideological camps. I think that we have to put the rhetoric aside and determine first how our budgetary choices will impact the economy. It's just basic common sense, and I suspect it's common sense to you also. Restoring the American dream was the centerpiece of my campaign, and it will remain my central focus as your representative in Congress. I ask for your help, your prayers, and most of all, your input. And I'll just leave you with this. I'm a member of the Episcopal Church here in Lexington. I go to church at the cathedral, and we've got a new bishop, and the bishop gave his first sermon the other day, and he said, you know, if you think about it, there's really only two prayers if you're a Christian. One is, thank you, thank you, thank you, and the other is, help me, help me, help me. And so to my friends here at Commerce Lexington, let me just say, thank you, thank you, thank you. Help me, help me, help me. Thanks so much. Be happy to take any questions. Maybe I answered them all. No, sir. Yes, sir. Well, we can certainly send them over to the Senate. I think, and we will be sending them over to the Senate. And you know, one of the problems is that, you know, in order to start that negotiation and compromise, you have to put proposal on the table. And I applaud Congressman Paul Ryan, Chairman of the Budget Committee, for passing a budget resolution in the last number of years. A lot of members of Congress were criticized for voting for that budget, which I think did tackle the mandatory spending crisis in our country. I was criticized in the campaign for supporting a Medicare reform proposal that kept our commitments to current seniors and people who are near retirement, but really dealt with a way to make Medicare a sustainable program and save that program for future generations. Whether you like that proposal or not, I think it is incumbent on Congress to do its job, which is to pass a budget and then send it to the other chamber. One of the dysfunctions in Washington is that we haven't had a budget come out of the Senate in the last 3 years. We need to have the Senate pass a budget. The House needs to pass a budget so that we can come together and we can really work on that together. And that's what I would call on the Senate to do, is to pass a budget. They may have different priorities from the House, but at least it will get us to the negotiating table. Well, let me just first thank my predecessor, Congressman Chandler, for his cooperation and his courtesy. Our staffs are working to prepare the transition and move those case files over. We are in the late stages, the final stages of my selection of a new chief of staff, and we're going to get that announced here pretty soon. We are also concluding a process of committee selection. I didn't know how involved that was, but I got a quick tutorial, and I'll have to say that our delegation in Washington, Chairman Rogers in particular, has been extremely, extremely helpful to me in navigating that process and putting my preferences to the leadership and getting a committee assignment. I am very, very optimistic that we're going to be assigned to a committee where we'll be situated to very much help the people of Central and Eastern Kentucky. I'm very excited about that opportunity, particularly as a freshman. You know, usually freshmen do not get a committee assignments, but we're really excited about some opportunities that may come our way there. That announcement will be made very shortly. Once we stand up our staff, once we get the committee assignment, we're going to be moving into the Longworth building. There was a lottery for freshman members of Congress, and this is a very well-publicized activity. I didn't realize how interested the media was in the selection of offices on Capitol Hill, but there's 70 new freshmen in this class, about equal Republican, Democrat, and you have a lottery. And the freshman members of Congress receive, of course, the last offices, but those 70 then get to pick a number out of a box to determine where your office selection will be. I was 29 out of 70. I mean, it's amazing what these freshman members of Congress do. One of them did a cartwheel before they drew from the hat. I did not, but we got a good number, 29, and I selected 1432 in the House Longworth building. I think this is a great location. It's centrally located. It's close to the Capitol. It's right in the middle of the office building, so it'll be very accessible to constituents who come up to Capitol Hill, and so that's how that's going. But it's going very, very well, and we appreciate moving that forward. Yes, sir.
Andy, thank you again for your service, and maybe this is covered by the Jeff Davis proposal, but it seems like we've passed a lot of legislation that people didn't understand when it was passed, and it wasn't very specific, and it's been left for 3, 4, 5 years for people to fill in the details and to enact the legislation. So it got passed in what seems like a very loose fashion that then unelected people figured out how to implement it, and that's taken so long. And I think that uncertainty is what contributes to the inability of people to make long-term decisions because they don't know the environment that they're going to be making them in. Is that new or?
Well, Mr. McIntosh, you know this better than others, being in the financial services industry. You know, Dodd-Frank is a statute that does just that, and two-thirds of that statute has not been implemented by the regulators, and so it creates massive uncertainty. You see that in the financial services sector. You see that in the energy sector with the Congress turning over a great deal of rulemaking authority to the Environmental Protection Agency. You see it all across government, where the Congress really has abdicated its responsibility as the lawmaking body. I teach constitutional law, and the very first substantive legal section of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, says that all lawmaking power shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. And regrettably, the Congress has delegated its lawmaking function to these unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats and executive branch agencies. I think the REINS Act solves that problem in part because it says to these unaccountable bureaucrats, you can propose a rule, but that if it's a significant rule, if it's going to cost the American people a significant amount in economic activity, that rule has to come back to the Congress, and the Congress has to vote on it before it goes into effect. So I'll be pushing for that, not only because it's going to block costly and environmentally destructive regulations, but because it restores the constitutional balance as envisioned by our founding fathers. Thank you all so much. Look forward to working with you.
On behalf of Commerce Lexington and specifically the Public Policy Council, we thank Congressman-Elect Barr for being here to share his principles with us, and we really look forward to your periodic return for updates on the progress. Also, one group that often gets overlooked, and that's Bob and his staff. So if you're Commerce Lexington staff, would you please stand and be recognized for the work that you do that kind of goes unrecognized at these, please, thank you. There is another Public Policy Council luncheon opportunity for you. Senator Rand Paul, I'll get it right, here on Friday, December the 14th from noon to 1:30, and that will be at the downtown Hilton. If you have not already signed up and want to, the folks, as you leave, would be glad to take your registration, or you can call Commerce Lexington. Lastly, would like to thank Kentucky American and the other sponsors who helped make this possible, and to thank each of you for your interest, for your attention, and your presence here today. I ask you to drive safely as you return to your homes or businesses. Thank you.